evolved. The plan of the talk is to give you first some background on cognitive pragmatics, then I'll discuss the interpretation of emotional expression, and I'll present a theoretical argument for the evolution of what I call emotional pragmatics. So first, some definitions. By ostensive stimuli, for instance, speaking or pointing, I mean stimuli that are produced with the intention to inform the audience of something, as well as the intention that the first intention be mutually manifest between communicator and audience. That be publicly known that one is trying to inform the audience of something. I'll say that an information is encoded in a stimulus when there is a fixed pre-established association, a code, between this type of stimulus and this type of information. So for instance, in a dictionary, you have an association between written words and their definition, and that is kind of a code. This is a kind of code. Now, typically what is encoded in ostensive stimuli, for instance in utterances, in sentences, underdetermine what these stimuli mean. That is, the information encoded isn't sufficient to explain what we understand the communicator to mean. For instance, Peter asks, "Did John pay back the money he owed you?" And Mary answers, "He forgot to go to the bank." Mary's answer, literally speaking, can be decoded thanks to English grammar and lexicon, which is the relevant code here, but that information, the encoded information, isn't sufficient to understand what Mary means, which is no. Alright, so what Mary means, that John didn't pay her back, isn't encoded in her sentence. Her sentence underdetermines what she means. Now, in relevance theory, which is a kind of cognitive pragmatics theory, people argue that the comprehension procedure whereby we understand more than what is encoded in ostensive stimuli can be described as follows. A. The stimulus is interpreted by an audience through an inferential process that is unconscious, automatic, and fast. This process is guided by a presumption of relevance. We expect the ostensive stimuli to be relevant to the question under discussion. The audience takes the information encoded in the stimulus. What grammar and lexicon of English tells us he forgot to go to the bank means, enriches the information encoded. For instance, we understand that bank is a monetary institution here and not a river bank, and complements this information. We infer that John didn't pay Mary back. And we do that thanks to our mind reading abilities. And an influential proposal that stems out of relevance theory is that, although it can be found also in theorists that are outside relevance theory, the proposal is that the comprehension procedure described by properties A to F is realized by an evolved cognitive mechanism whose function is to be automatically triggered by ostensive stimuli. And if true, this hypothesis goes quite a long way towards explaining how human language evolved, as Sperber, Tomasello, or Scott Phillips, for instance, argue. Not going to explain why, but if you want, you can ask in the Q&A. Now, this is our first hypothesis, and it sums up basically what I've said so far. There's a cognitive mechanism that we can call mprag that is responsible for the interpretation of ostensive stimuli beyond what is encoded in them, is automatically triggered by ostensive stimuli, and goes through the comprehension procedure properties A to F, and has been selected for by evolution. I will start from this hypothesis and assume that it is correct. Now let's go on to our second topic, the interpretation of emotional expression. What I will say here is that what we understand emotional expressions to me is underdetermined by the information encoded in them. So let's take this scenario. You're walking with a friend and you see some dogs, some ducks, and more ducks and not dog, and then you see these two cuties, and you see your friend going like this. If you're like me, in this scenario, you'd understand her facial expression to mean that she's touched, moved by this display of friendship among these cuties. Now compare this similar scenario. You see some dog and some ducks, and some more ducks and another dog, and then you see a dead rabbit, and you see your friend goes like this. In this scenario, if you're like me, you'd understand her face to mean that she's sad because of the dead rabbit. She's not moved or touched, and she's sad because of the dead rabbit. Okay. Same facial expression, different emotion kind expressed about a different object. Another example is a photograph that I took of my girlfriend when she was watching with me a video when we were on holidays, and it wasn't because she was sad that she was crying, but because the video was a surprise invitation to her 30th birthday, and she was moved, she was touched by the invitation from her friends. Same face could very well mean that she's sad, right? So, more generally, codes for facial expressions underdetermine what emotion kind is expressed, and these codes are at best probabilistic, like linguistic lexicons are. That is, the facial expression displayed here by Ekman may more often than not be associated with anger, this one with disgust, or this one with fear, but as these pictures show, in different contexts we may understand the same facial expression, here the expression of disgust, to mean disgust, anger, sadness, or fear. This facial expression may be associated with anger or being in intense pain, but here actually Serena Williams is ecstatic about her win. These facial expressions may mean that the person is angry, but here they are boastful, proud about the points they just scored. So, what facial expression encode is ambiguous. The same facial expression is associated with different emotion kinds, depending on the context. The same is true of vocal expression, so I'm not going to detail that, but this is a code for that associates emotion kinds and types of acoustic cues, and this code, though valid in many cases, is not always correct. Sometimes the same cues can mean different emotions. Same with laughter. And so in general, there is a first type of underdeterminacy, which is that what emotional expressions encode underdetermines what type of emotion they express. But there is a further type of underdeterminacy with emotional expression, which is that what they encode also underdetermines what they are about. Facial expression, vocal cues don't tell you what the emotion is about, though this is something that we readily understand. We easily understand what emotions are about. We easily understand that our friend is moved by these cuties and not by something else. Another example here quickly. Someone says, "You must be starving. I've made some chili carne." And if the person answers, "I've already eaten," with that face, you understand that the person is disappointed or sad about the fact that he cannot eat chili con carne. And if they answer, "I've already eaten," with this face, you will surely understand that they are happy or grateful about the proposition, though they cannot eat the delicious chili con carne. You easily disambiguate what the emotions are about. So despite both forms of underdeterminacy, we effortlessly, automatically disambiguate emotional expressions. How? Well, my hypothesis is that we disambiguate them just like we disambiguate ostensive stimuli, even if emotional expressions aren't ostensive, even if they aren't produced with an intention to inform the audience, and that this informative intention be mutually manifest between communicator and audience. Usually emotional expressions are spontaneous, they are not produced with such communicative intentions, and therefore they are not ostensive. So my proposal is that if relevance theorists are correct that we interpret ostensive stimuli through the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure, then so do we for emotional non-ostensive stimuli. So for instance here, the emotional expression is interpreted by the audience through an inferential process that is unconscious, automatic, and fast. The process is guided by a presumption of relevance, that is, she cries for a reason, for something that's relevant to the situation. Because in general, emotional reactions to stimuli emotions are reactions to stimuli perceived as highly relevant to a person's goals. The audience takes the information encoded in the emotional expression, the ambiguous code, which means that when someone cries, they can be sad or touched or perhaps something else, enriches this information. She's touched, she's not sad, and she's touched by her friend's video, and complements this information. Pauline's grateful, this moment will be engraved on her memory, she's looking forward to seeing her friends again, thanks to our mind reading abilities. Because I know that French is very important to her and that she doesn't miss her friends so badly. This is thanks to these abilities also that I'm able to understand what she is expressing with her facial expression. So the second hypothesis of my presentation sums up what I've said in the second part. There is a cognitive mechanism, MXP, that is responsible for the interpretation of non-ostensive emotional expressions beyond what is encoded in them, is automatically triggered by emotional expression, and goes through comprehension procedures with properties A to F. So we reach now the third and final part, the argument for the evolution of emotional pragmatics. And it's just the first and the second hypothesis that I've spelled out before. Again, there is a cognitive mechanism, MPRAG, that is responsible for the interpretation of ostensive stimuli beyond what is encoded in them. It is automatically triggered by ostensive stimuli, goes through the comprehension procedure with properties A to F, and has been selected for by evolution. 2. There is a cognitive mechanism, MX, that is responsible for the interpretation of non-ostensive emotional expressions beyond what is encoded in them, is automatically triggered by emotional expressions, and goes through a comprehension procedure with properties A to F. Now, if hypotheses 1 and 2 are correct, then the interpretation of ostensive stimuli, would argue, and of non-ostensive emotional expressions are realized by the same cognitive mechanism. Why? Because they share the same properties. It wouldn't make sense that we have two cognitive mechanisms that do the same tasks. That's what this further hypothesis says, and if so, then MX, or emotional pragmatics, has been selected for by evolution, because this is what is implied by the hypothesis 1, and the fact that the two abilities are realized by the same mechanism. So, voilà, that's my argument. Now, here are some consequences of if this argument is true. The first one is that the inferential comprehension procedure studied by pragmaticists is triggered automatically not only by ostensive stimuli but also by non-ostensive emotional expressions. This is against a claim central in relevance theory and beyond. So the question then is, what is the proper domain of this mechanism? Are there other kinds of stimuli that automatically trigger it too? Second consequence, pragmatic abilities, and thus language, may find their evolutionary origins in emotional pragmatics. Why? Because the interpretation of ambiguous emotional expressions plausibly was around before that of ostensive stimuli. And if so, a question is, can we find traces of emotional pragmatics in other primate species? And some primatologists' evidence suggests that we can. Well, thank you for your attention. Here are my references.